Good afternoon and welcome on behalf of Memorial Hall Library. I'm Stephanie Traina. Thank you to the Wilmington Memorial Library and the Addison Gallery for partnering with us on today's program. We're fortunate to have the Addison Gallery of American Art right here in Andover, and we hope this virtual tour today will inspire you to visit the museum in person. Admission is always free, and the Addison is open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., and Sundays, 1 to 5. Masks must be worn at all times when visiting the museum. We are recording today's program, and I've enabled live captions, which you can turn on or off at your end. We'll save questions for the end, and you can put those in the Q&A box. The exhibit Curator Gordon Wilkins will be talking about today is Learning to Look, the Addison at 90. He'll explore works and themes from the exhibition. Many of you already know, but I always like to say it anyway. Gordon Wilkins is the Robert M. Walker Associate Curator of American Art. He joined the Addison in 2018, and he worked previously at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Mass., the Farnsworth Art Museum in Rockland, Maine, and the Newberry Library in Chicago. So thank you, Gordon, for being with us today, and please join me in welcoming Gordon Wilkins.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you again to our wonderful Memorial Hall Library and the Wilmington Memorial Library for collaborating with us on these programs. It's always such a pleasure to be able to join you. So today I'm going to talk, and I should mention also, if the background looks unfamiliar, I'm reporting live from Los Angeles, where it's 11 a.m. instead of 2. I'm sure you know about time zones, but if the background seems unfamiliar, if there are any noises, I apologize in advance. But today we're going to talk about Learning to Look, the Addison at 90, which is a show that I organize with my colleagues Allison Kemmerer and Tessa Height at the Addison. And this is a celebration of our 90th anniversary, which we are celebrating all year round this year. We opened to the public in May of 1931. And we've had a full slate of various exhibitions and programs this year that have celebrated this milestone in our history. So as I mentioned, the Addison opened its doors in 1931, and this may be, I may be rehashing some familiar themes or information that you've heard before in my tours, but I'll just give you a very brief overview of the history, the founding of the Addison. So the Addison was the idea of Thomas Cochrane, who's pictured here on the left of your screen. He was a graduate of Phillips Academy. He was in the class of 1890. He would go on to be a pretty significant college football coach. He then began his career in the financial world and worked his way up as a partner at J.P. Morgan's firm. And he amassed quite a vast fortune. And he had no heirs. His wife tragically passed away. He had no children of his own. And so he knew that his main legacy on this earth would be through his philanthropic endeavors, not through his family carrying on his name, for example. And a place that he had always hoped to give back to in a very significant way, because he had such a formative experience as a young man at Andover, was the academy. And he certainly gave back in a way that's almost incomprehensible by today's standards of philanthropy. He really radically transformed the campus and added many of the buildings and institutions that we're most familiar with now at Andover. For example, he built or helped fund the building of George Washington Hall, the Cochrane Chapel, the Cochrane Bird Sanctuary. I should mention these are both not named after Thomas Cochrane himself, but based on relatives. He named no buildings after himself and conducted his philanthropic efforts at Andover anonymously, although it was sort of a poorly kept secret. He also paid for the library, and he totally redesigned the campus with the help of Charles Platt, the architect. And he would sort of on a whim decide that he wanted to move a building 90 degrees or relocate the building completely. So this was an era of kind of big philanthropic efforts. And what was also interesting, though, is that he was doing this really mostly, the bulk of his activities happened after the stock market crash and into the early 1930s. So you can imagine that he was able to accomplish things on a uh, rather inexpensively because of the need for desperation for labor and for any sorts of income during the Depression. But it was also quite remarkable that he was able to pull off this major philanthropic feat really really at the height of the Great Depression. But in his terms of trust, which we abide by to this day, he discusses his motivation for founding the gallery. And I should also note that he was not an art collector really of any sort prior to the founding of the Addison. But he believed that bent on a desire to enrich permanently the lives of the students of Phillips Academy by helping to cultivate and foster in them a love for the beautiful, I should be glad to establish at the Academy, if entirely acceptable to the Board of Trustees, an endowed gallery of American art. And this is the terms of trust written in 1930, and they went quite quickly to realize his vision, and he assembled quite a significant collection, which he had already begun to assemble prior to the terms of trust, starting in the late 1920s, and really aided by several key advisors. As I mentioned, Cochrane himself was not really much of an art collector, but he was connected to many, including perhaps most importantly, Lizzie Bliss, who was the sister-in-law of his good friend, Zadie Cobb Bliss. And it's actually after Zadie Cobb Bliss's mother, who was an Addison, a member of the Addison family, that we got our name, the Addison. It's not after Cochrane or after a member of his family. It's a tribute to his dear friend's family. He was also, as I mentioned, quite a shrewd businessman and very, very knowledgeable when it came to things like marketing and advertising. And he knew that in any alphabetical listing of museums, Addison would come, if not first, right up at the top. So he was very smart and shrewd, and nothing was done without a fair amount of intentionality behind it. But he began to amass this collection, aided by people like Zadie Cobb, but most importantly, Lizzie Bliss, who was one of the founders of MoMA, and also with the help of Robert McIntyre, who was a partner at a Macbeth Gallery. And that gallery acted as sort of a middleman as Cochrane assembled the core collection of about 400 works that were present at the museum when the museum opened its doors in 1931. You can see here some of the collection was installed on campus. This is actually the trustee boardroom on the top floor of George Washington Hall, and you can see quite a few iconic works in the Addison's collection installed in the boardroom, including the West Wing, which is right between the two windows on the far left of the photograph, with the campus, what I believe is the campus plan beneath it. But it became clear that there needed to be a more permanent home for the collection, and so he proposed the construction of the Addison. And in order to accommodate the Addison, they had to demolish what appeared to be a very beautiful Gothic Revival chapel. And you can see that the construction went forward prior to the demolition of the chapel. And when we see the photo of the opening day of the Addison, you can actually see the chapel is still visible and had not yet been demolished. The Cochrane Chapel would later replace the original, or not original, but the Victorian Gothic Chapel. Cochrane and Platt could not stand Victorian any sort of Gothic Revival architecture, and really made a very deliberate act on their part to rid the campus of Victorian architecture quite broadly, and restore the architecture to their vision of this kind of unified colonial revival, Georgian revival aesthetic that we now know of today, which is a rather austere sort of brick temple front facade buildings that you think of when you think of Andover's campus. Here you can see an image to the right of our famous manship Venus fountain, which has anchored our rotunda from the very beginning. And here's an interesting side-by-side that shows a lot has changed in the 90 years that the Addison has been open, but still students are lounging on, or well, in those days, in 1931, this would have been totally verboten. Students, well, first of all, you wouldn't have had female students at Andover, but if you had female students, they certainly would not have been on the grass. You would have gotten a certain number of demerits for sitting on the grass or walking on the grass in those days. So I guess a lot has changed, but still, we are a center for student activities. We are a major resource for the curriculum at Andover and a major center in our region and more broadly. And this is the photo I was talking about where you can see the original, the chapel that would have been on site prior to the construction of the Cochrane Chapel. And here we are in a rotunda. So we started with the collection of about 400 works. Thomas Cochrane also stipulated in his terms of trust that we could show anything we wanted. And in the very early days of the Addison's history, there were shows organized on topics ranging from European textiles to Chinese painting. So there was a very broad range of exhibitions mounted at the Addison, not all of an American focus. But Cochrane stipulated that the Addison could only acquire works by either native-born or naturalized US citizens, which is, I think, in our current day, kind of is a very sort of outmoded or somewhat troubling outlook. But to put it in historical context, this was very much a nativist period. The Great Depression was largely blamed on Europe and outside influences, and there was this very deliberate effort at that time to look inwards, to establish sort of an American history, a usable past, as it has been called, and art played a major role in forging and defining this American identity, which was an American identity, of course, that has been called into question, that was always sort of built on a very wobbly foundation, and one that privileged the voices of almost exclusively white male artists in the context of the Addison. There were a few works by female artists included in the founding collection, but you couldn't count those on one hand. But Cochrane was very aware that American art had traditionally been looked at as secondary to European art, and really not even in the same league. People thought of American art as sort of mere pastiche, as sort of a poor imitation of European art. And Cochrane believed that American art ought to be celebrated. And I think he was concerned that if he didn't put such a rigid acquisition policy in place, that the Addison could veer into territories beyond American art and thus kind of muddle his founding vision, which was for the Addison to be a beacon of light in the American art landscape and be really the defining collection of American art in the United States. And because of that vision and that really strong emphasis on quality, which was baked into the foundation of our collection, we have accumulated over the past 90 years one of the most significant collections of American art in the world. And we now own nearly 25,000 works in our collection, which is quite a significant number, particularly when you consider the size of our institution. And while we're best known perhaps for our American paintings, including 8 Bells to the right of the screen, more than half of our collection is comprised of photography, and you will almost always see photography mixed into our installations. It is really at the core of what we do, and it is one of the most important collections of American photography in the world as well. So Learning to Look is our attempt to not distill, because that's really hard to distill 90 years and 25,000 objects into 4 galleries, and originally 5, plus a selection of archival material in our Museum Learning Center. But we decided that we would very deliberately choose works that help to tell the story of the Addison. If you come see the show, which will be up through the end of the year, you'll see that our labels are not heavy-duty art historical interpretation. We're more interested in presenting factoids, Addison firsts, bits of information that can really help tell the story of the Addison Gallery through our objects. And we've also done things to highlight the various artist alumni of Phillips Academy, our artists in residence as well, which is an incredible program. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're highlighting those. But right here, straight off the bat, we have 8 Bells, which is sort of something that we cannot avoid putting in any celebration of the Addison because it's by far our most famous painting. Eight Bells was a significantly expensive painting at the time of its purchase. It was purchased in 1930 by Thomas Cochrane for around $65,000, which would be, I believe, close to $1.3 million in today's money, which was an exceptional sum of money at the time and was actually the highest price paid for an American painting at that point. It was originally in the Clark Collection of American Paintings, which was sold off at the turn of the 20th century and seeded many insignificant collections of American art, including the Addisons. Here you can see a great telegram that was sent to James Sawyer, who was the first who was a member of the administration and the father actually of our first curator / director, Charles Sawyer. And he says, Robert McIntyre, working for Macbeth Gallery, says, we have just secured the brush painting and the great Homer Eight Bells for which we have been negotiating these past 2 months. And Eight Bells was already well known at the time of its purchase. And here we have 2 examples, actually the telegram is included, so 3 examples of ephemera connected to the purchase of Eight Bells. And these documents can be seen in our Museum Learning Center in a focus exhibition that I organized, drawn from our archival collections, which I gave a talk on a few months ago, which you can see online if you're so inclined. Here we have a certificate of authenticity, which is quite quaint by today's standards. So think about this. This is, the original NFT. Sorry to go there. And then on the right, we have our receipt for the painting, which you can see, it includes the commission to Macbeth Gallery, and it came out around the purchase price for the painting alone without the commission was $65,000, which was front page news, quite literally at the time. And here we have Eight Bells. And the show is about looking. It's called Learning to Look, the Addison at 90. We wanted to, you kind of have to get Eight Bells out of the way, or else people will be searching throughout every gallery for it. So we wanted to provide people really with what they want right off the bat. But also it is fundamentally a painting about the act of looking, about looking closely, which is something that we try to foster in our exhibitions, in our programs, and in our educational mission. And here you have 2 men, like so much of Homer's work, it's left very much ambiguous. There's a story being told, but we don't quite know the beginning or the ending. We know that these 2 men are on some sort of vessel, that they're utilizing their instruments in order to perhaps chart a course. The sky is sort of foreboding, so we don't know if they're perhaps trying to search for dry land, if they're stuck in a storm. We just don't know. It's up in the air. It's sort of unresolved, which is the great power of Homer's paintings. And this has also been seen by the many generations of students who have stared at this painting as a metaphor for their time at Andover, or really a metaphor for the high school experience in general, where you're sort of adrift during the 4 years of high school, trying to figure out what's next. If it's college, if it's something else, you're trying to chart a course that makes sense, that you can follow. And you're really at this pivotal transitional moment in your life. So this painting has accumulated a great deal of deep personal sort of affinities amongst the Andover community, and really resonates with our student audience. In particular, it resonates with everyone, but in particular, it seems to have a great deal of resonance with our students. And this painting, as I mentioned, was well known. It was shown in the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It was known through prints. So it was a major coup for the Addison to acquire this, and was part of the founding collection, was on view when the Addison opened. So again, to distill 90 years of history, 25,000 objects into originally 5 galleries, we decided, instead of trying to do a chronological show, at one point we were sort of thinking of maybe one work of art for each year that we were open. So instead of that, we decided to think very generally and came up with 3 main groupings. And I'll focus on 2 of the 3 because the third, which was the figure, is no longer on view. The first 2 themes, land and abstraction, will be on view until the end of the year. So I won't torture you with things that are no longer on view, but instead I'll focus on what you can see when you come to the Addison. And the first theme that we're looking at is the land. And here's a view of the first gallery. These are in the front 4 galleries. So when you come in up the stairs to the Addison, and you enter our rotunda and you see the Manship fountain in front of you. These are the galleries to the left-hand side. And in this image, we have the back wall in that first gallery. On the left, we have a work by Sally Mann, the great photographer of the South. And then you have an Edwin Dickinson, a Winslow Homer, and a George Inness. And you might think, how do these works relate? This is a show really about drawing connections. And we try to make our kind of curatorial process as transparent as possible. But again, people can pay attention to the kind of connections that we are intentionally making, but people are finding new connections that we had not even thought about, which is the most exciting thing about these kinds of shows, is that people are drawing connections between works, disparate works that we really were not cognizant of when we put together the show. But in this case, we very carefully wanted to sort of create this mood of the kind of drama, how the turmoil of the sea, of the natural world. You have the photograph of the Antietam Battlefield on the left, which is barely legible. It's Sally Mann embodying this sort of dying soldier on the field of Antietam, and it's the last glimpse of light that the soldier is seeing, and this kind of blurry, maybe his eyes are covered in his own blood, and he's looking out through, and he sees this bit of light on the horizon before he dies. It's not all such a downer, I can assure you, but there's quite a bit of sort of more macabre work. But then you go into the Dickinson, which is this very painterly part of his series of premier coup paintings, where he would start and finish a painting within 24 hours. So it's this very quasi-abstract expressionist depiction of a cliff in France. And then that sort of transitions you into The West Wind, which is this wonderful painting of a lone female figure on the rocky coast of Prout's Neck in Maine, near Winslow's home and studio. And she's bracing herself against the onslaught of the wind and the waves, and it looks like she could fall right into the ocean. And this painting is one of our great icons of the collection. And we actually have a letter on view in our Museum Learning Center written to Thomas Cochrane by the woman in the painting. And she did not know that she was being painted by Winslow Homer until much later, and recognized herself because she wore a tam o'shanter hat. And you can see that in the painting. And then leading into the George Inness of The Coming Storm. So this kind of stormy feeling wall, where each work, even though they're separated by distinct time periods, each work kind of flows into the next. And this is, again, an approach that would not be necessarily taken by other institutions. And we have a lot of flexibility at the Addison. We're a smaller museum. We also have an incredible collection to work with. And because of that, it's a wellspring of different ideas, and this almost never-ending resource of fresh sort of installation. So we never have permanently installed galleries. That's never been part of the Addison's sort of identity as a museum. We operate almost like a Kunsthal in the sense that we change everything constantly, but have this incredible permanent collection to work with. So we like to have a balance of permanent collection installations and then temporary changing exhibitions that are perhaps driven by loans or are traveling shows from other institutions. And so that allows us almost to use our galleries like laboratories where we're trying out combinations. We're not wedded to those combinations, those juxtapositions, because unlike our other museums that are larger, we have the flexibility of rotating the galleries quite frequently. And we can also, because of that, show light sensitive materials with a great deal of regularity, because almost every museum has tried to incorporate paintings or works on paper into their paintings galleries, but because you can really stick a painting on the wall for an indeterminate period of time without worrying about light damage if you have proper light controls. You don't have that same freedom with works on paper, where you're rule of thumb, you expose for 6 months and then they're off view for several years. So usually a rotation will be planned, but because of staffing, etc., planning, you'll put a photograph up for 6 months, and then usually you give up and put a painting back on view in the place of the photograph. We don't have that challenge, which is really a lot of fun and sets us apart. And so this pairing here, this juxtaposition of these three works, is maybe baffling, I think on a very purely formal level, you can see something of a similar color palette shared across these three works. What we decided here was to kind of surprise the viewer. That's another thing I should mention in our installations. We mix time periods. We always or tend to, unless we're doing a 19th century show, if we're doing a general permanent collection show, we like to mix and draw connections between the more historical collections and the contemporary collections. So in the center we have this really fantastic, recently acquired Linda Benglis, the great feminist sculptor, a piece of handmade paper that's wrapped around chicken wire with this amazing turquoise paint application with orange and black and white, and then also gold leaf, very carefully placed. And it really holds the room and is quite a strong, really quite visually appealing piece. You might wonder, why is this in the land section? Linda Benglis is referencing the kingbird / pinion jay, which are bluebirds that live, blue jays, or type of jay rather, that lives outside of her studio in New Mexico. And so she's capturing sort of the flitting motion of the bluebirds with this color also referencing the feathers. And then we saw that as a great opportunity to draw a parallel to our Audubon collection, since she's very much referencing part of the natural world, so it fits into this land section. We have Audubon's 4-volume double elephant folio Birds of America, and so it was a great excuse to bring those out and to pair a very similar species to the one that Linda Benglis is referencing in the same vicinity as the work that was inspired by the birds. And then also you have this wonderful Charles Prendergast piece which helps us also tell the story of how the Addison was the first museum to give the Prendergast brothers a proper retrospective. And because of that, the Prendergast, Charles and his widow, later on were very, very generous to the Addison. And the gold leaf of this exquisite carved panel, which was a gift of Lizzie Bliss and hung in her apartment, this beautiful color palette, this sort of jewel toned, very rich color palette, the blues and the gold leaf really, I think, respond quite nicely or play very well with the Benglis and the Audubon. So these are the kinds of unusual, challenging, surprising, but hopefully fun and accessible pairings that we like to do at the Addison. This wall here is sort of the wall of the West, anchored in the center by this spectacular Frederick Remington. And the wall also really charts the course of westward expansion and the sort of the really incomprehensible damage that was inflicted upon the Western landscape by European Americans as they made their way across the continent in the fulfillment of this vision of manifest destiny and of an American continent that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So we have visions of the Western landscape, some that, like this Moy Bridge, are sort of the propagandistic images of this pure, unadulterated landscape. This is Yosemite, Cottonwood Bend. And then you have on the right-hand side sort of an unvarnished look at the Western landscape with Carlton Watkins' depiction of this really violent act of hydraulic mining, of taking high-pressured hoses and just pointing them at cliff sides in order to dislodge gravel, debris, and all kinds of things. And that caused, of course, erosion and physically reshaped the landscape and the land. And then at the center, you have this wolf that's bearing witness to this vast change in its landscape. Remington being this very in our current world, I guess I should say, a very controversial and rightly so artist for his depictions of indigenous peoples. Here we have a wolf, which at the time when this was painted in the early 20th century was really almost on the brink of extinction. And that was largely caused because the ranchers and farmers of the West, which who had broken the land up with fences and used the vast landscape for their cattle, etc., saw the wolf as nuisance animals and would kill them in mass because they were perhaps they would put prey on their livestock, and in order to stop that, they were killed in this sort of quasi mass extinction. And so the wolf is really making direct eye contact with the viewer and staring you down, and there's this beautiful resonance between the eyes, these glowing yellow eyes of the wolf, and the stars in the sky. And I think you could read this also as a commentary on this sort of lost civilization narrative, this notion that indigenous peoples were disappearing from the land, and so artists like Remington and Edward Curtis needed to very carefully, and with this sort of 19th century inspired scientific racism, document the native people. So here you have the last of his kind, this wolf looking right at you, and you could almost see sort of indicting the viewer for their own participation in the collapse of this species and of its native lands. There's also humor in this show. It's been kind of dark so far. Excuse me. Here we have two images that we've paired side by side, which is sort of like the banal and the sublime side by side. We have Ansel Adams' beautiful view of the West Valley from the tunnel in Yosemite, also depicting Inspiration Point, and then you have woman with scarf at Inspiration Point in Yosemite. And this is this great sort of meta exploration of the land, and we've seen how the land was consumed, and here we have its consumption in a different way, which is through photographic means, and then also through tourism, where this woman is wearing a scarf that depicts the site that she's actually looking at. It's this sort of meta visualization or meta looking that's going on in this fantastic and quite humorous and very witty Roger Minnick photograph, part of his Sightseers series from 1980. So we're pairing the kind of holy, spiritual vision of Ansel Adams with this sort of tongue-in-cheek, witty, kind of pessimistic viewpoint espoused by Roger Minnick to bring some levity to the installation. And so we've gone from the land part one, which really looked at the sort of raw canvas, the blank canvas of the landscape. And here we go into looking at images of the populated landscape, the transformed landscape. Oops, sorry, going backwards. And something that we had not intended, but is quite a nice sightline, is between the wolf and this wonderful painting called "He that by the plow would thrive himself must either hold or drive," which the title is from a saying by Benjamin Franklin. And these stare at each other across the passageway from one gallery to the next. And here you have almost a before and after, which this painting is really one of the most, I would say, succinct and important depictions of this sort of European American conception of the natural world. It was painted by a currently unknown artist in the early to mid 19th century, probably in Pennsylvania. And it depicts this kind of hard scrabble farm, which would have been the sort of agrarian ideal of the small farmer making his life off the land. You have their cabin, you have you have sort of all the hallmarks of the 19th century American farm scene. You have the woman with the lamb, you have a woman milking a cow, you have a man behind a plow. But then you also have these examples of very damaging agricultural practices like slash and burn agriculture. You almost seem as though you're looking at this bombed out post-apocalyptic landscape where you have fires burning full of debris, and you see the stumps of trees that had been cut down, and then you have these gashes in the earth caused by the plow, and it's this vision of breaking the land, of really taming the landscape. And it was seen in terms of a religious kind of this Christian quest to tame the land. And the mark of civilization in the eyes of the dominant culture was the turning of wild lands into agricultural lands, arable land that could be then utilized to support your family, to support your lifestyle. But this was a task that was seen as never being over. You were constantly having to continue to be vigilant of the land, because the devil, quite literally in their minds, would take control over what you had done if you were not constantly fighting it off. And so there's this vine on this tree, which is otherwise sort of dead. This vine that, I think, thinking about this in a religious framework as kind of the Garden of Eden, this kind of snake-like serpentine vine is choking the tree, and if it's not caught, which it does not appear to have been, it's sort of foreboding, a harbinger of destruction on this farm. So very heavy-handed religious kind of message in this, but nevertheless a really fascinating depiction of a 19th century conception of the natural world. So not everything in this show is installed next to each other for sort of a contextual reason, or in order to convey a narrative. Some things are just kind of interesting with each other, or are meant to draw more formal parallels. So here we have this wall of industrial scenes. They're linked by a shared genre, but then within each work, we encourage, or we hope that people will jump from one to the next. And so, for example, we have this Whistler on one side, and then next to it is this Haynes photo of Gloucester Mill, which was a mill in Montana, a very remote mill that was captured in this mammoth plate albumin print. Mammoth plate was the largest kind of commercially available size for your glass plate negative. And it's quite a striking image. You can see that it holds up reasonably well next to the Whistler. But we're hoping that people will visually travel from the bridge, this diagonal bridge, with the smokestack, and draw a visual parallel between this bridge that sort of goes upwards and then resolves itself as it turns down to the right-hand side and enters into this mill in the next picture, really a mill attached to a mine. The Whistler is really interesting. It was Whistler's first significant commission, and it was commissioned by a Greek magnate living in London, who is also at one point one of the governors general of the Crystal Palace, which you can see. I don't know if this works. You can see in the background here the outline of the Crystal Palace. And as I mentioned, we're not giving heavy-handed art historical commentary in our labels. Instead, we're trying to come up with sort of fun facts. One of the kind of more interesting things about this work, which is spectacular on its own and very historically significant, because it's the sort of his first part of his first sustained engagement with the Battersea Bridge and this really iconic London scene. But also it was x-rayed at one point, and it was revealed that there's actually a Whistler self-portrait underneath the surface of this painting. He had reused a canvas. He was at that time quite young. He was in his 20s, and did not have the money to pay for a new canvas. So he just reused what he considered to be an unsuccessful self-portrait and painted right over it. So we have this image reproduced in the gallery. And here's a pairing that we've never considered before. And a lot of times entropy or kind of luck goes into curation. It's not all deliberate. We're not planning everything out to the, and installing everything in a scale model. And we don't really work that way. We sort of work on the floor, moving things around. These two paintings, which are both icons of our collection, just happen to be brought up from storage at the same time and put side by side. And once you see the connection, you can't unsee it. What's great about these are there are many things. Edward Hopper's represented on the left with Freight Cars Gloucester, and on the right is Stuart Davis's Red Card. Both really remarkable scenes of Gloucester that were painted within 4 years of each other by two artists in whose company you would never sort of encounter at a museum. You would see Edward Hopper in perhaps one wing of the gallery or the museum, maybe focus on regionalism or American naturalistic American painting. Then you have Stuart Davis, who would be in a completely different section, perhaps in a larger encyclopedic museum. You would almost, I can't think of any other opportunity to see Winslow Homer and Edward Hopper and Stuart Davis side by side, but they're both Gloucester pictures, and you can almost start to see, once you think about them in relation to one another, you can start to see sort of points of comparison almost directly between one and the next. The strong diagonal lines, the chimneys, the spires of this church. it's the sort of the cart referencing transportation. There's there's a lot between these two works that makes for an interesting experimental pairing. And it also helps to show that you can encounter a very similar place or some entirely or a similar scene and approach it stylistically in radically different ways at almost the same exact time. We also have photography embedded throughout the installation. This wonderful Martin Wong painting anchoring the center, surrounded by images of the industrialized landscape. On the left-hand side, really focused on New York, and on the right-hand side, focused on New York and then also the West and the South. And there are images by Louis Baltz and Robert Adams, among others. Another way that we connect this installation to our history is by highlighting in the galleries the archival materials that we have on view in our Museum Learning Center. And the Addison was the first museum to give John Sloan, the great Ashcan School painter, a retrospective. And we have one of his undeniable masterpieces, Sunday Women Drying Their Hair. But we also have this great letter, and he was quite a difficult person to work with, apparently. We have that. We have firsthand accounts from curators working with him at the time that he was quite curmudgeonly. But he also planned out in this letter the design of his catalog accompanying the show. So we are bringing to life our archival materials through their connections with works in the galleries. And so the second section that we'll be looking at is abstraction. And this is to the right of the fountain when you enter in. And the Addison has a remarkable collection of American abstraction. And that's due largely to its commitment to abstraction and to the avant-garde, really from the very beginning. The Addison was always seen as the more radical sort of counterpart to the MFA in New England. The MFA was not, I'm trying to say this as diplomatically as possible. They essentially slept through the 20th century. They were very reluctant to embrace modernism or avant-garde art, whereas the Addison, which kind of had nothing to lose, was more willing to try things out. Since we're a teaching museum, that kind of spirit of challenging the minds of our viewers has always been at the core. We also don't charge admission, which has allowed us a certain level of freedom because we're not concerned all the time about bringing in large numbers of people, or perhaps having a show that might seem too niche for a general audience, that kind of thing. Although we, of course, always think about our various audiences when we're planning shows. But that's allowed a certain level of freedom. And because of that, we forged relations very early on with artists who would become some of the most important modern artists of our time, or of the 20th century. So, for example, we have on this wall, one of the very first Pollocks acquired by a teaching museum. We have important work by George O'Keeffe on the far left, Louise Nevelson on the far right. The Calder in the center I'll come back to. And then we have Mark Tobey, second from the left, the Pollock in the center, Mark Bradford, and Louise Nevelson. And this is another interesting kind of unintended pairing that takes place across galleries. So the Pollock on the left is in this first gallery, they happen next to each other, but there's another pairing that I'll talk about. But this goes to show that we're always mixing sort of earlier work with more contemporary practice, looking at the ways in which the past inspires the present. These are both works that are extremely tactile. You want to reach out and touch them desperately. Unfortunately, the Pollock is behind plexi. Unfortunately, for people who would want to touch them, which we don't want you to touch, obviously, but it's behind plexi. So even though it looks like there's nothing there, if you try to get too close to it, you'll reach a barrier. But it's this very heavily built up surface. It's one of Pollock's really transitional pieces when he was still doing these highly textured built up surfaces, and would move on to a sort of a flatter, though still built up texture on his canvases that would come in the decade following this work. What's also great about this is it has impeccable provenance. It was a gift from Peggy Guggenheim, his great patron. She actually offered the Addison 2 paintings by Pollock, but our director at the time thought that Phosphorescence, pictured here, was better than the other one. So he turned down a Pollock, which you look back and you cringe, but he made many, many prescient acquisitions. So we can't fault our the past for missing out on having a second Pollock. But then we have it paired with Mark Bradford, who's an African-American artist who works here in Los Angeles. And this is an interesting work because it's built up with layers and layers of what we would consider to be detritus. He picks up trash in his neighborhoods, trash that has really deep personal significance, including things like foil from beauty salons. He was a hairdresser before he turned his attention to art. And he also really impresses rope and different materials into the canvas in order to get this texture. So it's this raised texture, mixed media piece, but really in the spirit of Pollock. And that juxtaposition brings out the similarities and differences. This is a really interesting moment here in the exhibition where we're able to tell a very Phillips Academy oriented story. And this is a story of 3 generations of artists, Hans Hofmann, Maud Morgan, and Frank Stella. Frank Stella, of course, is one of the most famous artist alumni of Phillips Academy. And he was a student who was beloved by Maud Morgan, and he was very, very loyal to Maud Morgan and saw Maud Morgan as being really fundamental to his development as an artist. And Maud Morgan, who was a student of Hans Hofmann, owned this painting on the left, Exaltment, which is a great Hofmann painting in our collection from 1947. And Frank Stella used to visit Maud Morgan and her husband, Patrick Morgan, who both were iconic art instructors at Andover and Abbott. And he would come to their house fairly regularly with his classmates, including Carl Andre, Hollis Frampton, and other art students. And they would sort of operate this salon on campus for students interested in the arts. And this painting was installed in their house. And so Frank Stella would go to their house and just stare at this painting. And he's spoken about how this particular painting had a really profound influence on his career trajectory, and that he's really tried to capture the spirit or the excitement that he felt when he first saw this painting in his own work. Maud Morgan is represented in the center with this wonderful triptych, quite large piece. And then we have Frank Stella, this early kind of transitional piece from 1958. Just at the end of 1958, he would begin his black painting. So it's this really interesting moment of he had just gotten out of Princeton and he's about to embark on this whirlwind career that would establish him as perhaps the greatest American painter of our time. But it's a story that really could only happen at Andover through the exposure to abstraction by way of an instructor who was very connected to the avant-garde and abstract communities. And what we've done in our labels here is to call out when an artist is a graduate of the Academy. So Frank Stella was the class of 1954. He was also an artist in residence, part of our Edward E. Elston Artist in Residence program in 1999. So when you come, you can look on the labels and you can see all of the artists who have been artists in residence over the years. And then also a lot of the artists who you perhaps had no idea that they had a connection to Andover. Frank Stella has been incredibly generous, not only with his own work, but with the work of his contemporaries. Back in the early 1990s, he worked with then director Jock Reynolds on what was called the Addison Art Drive. And he knew that the Addison had wonderful historic collections, but we had sort of fallen behind in terms of modern and contemporary collections. So he set about to add significant works by living artists, mixture of living and and 20th century artists. And so because of his incredible generosity, we have works by Jasper Johns, including this Target, which is probably the only Jasper Johns work not on view at the Whitney or the Philadelphia Museum of Art right now in their big retrospective, but we're very glad to have it on view at the Addison. This wonderful small drawing by Agnes Martin, and then this wonderful, really, really important sculpture by Donald Judd from 1965, which is a really transitional work that marks this point of demarcation between the works that Donald Judd fabricated himself versus the works that he sent out to be fabricated by outside firms. And we undertook quite significant conservation on this work and determined that the blue tube that you see on top of the galvanized iron boxes has the original Harley-Davidson Hi-Fi blue lacquer motorcycle paint finish on it. It is one of the best preserved surface Donald Judd surfaces from this time. And so, it's the kind of thing that if you touch it, your fingerprint is kind of like encapsulated in amber and can't come out. So we have to be very careful about people not touching this because of the incredible surface. It's also, a great opportunity to tell these kinds of behind the scenes stories. This used to live in Frank Stella's basement, and his cats enjoyed nesting in the galvanized iron boxes. So a fair bit of the conservation was to undo some cat-related corrosion issues. But it's in great shape now and back on view, and we couldn't be more delighted. And there are three, sorry, I put up two when I meant to say three. There are two others. This is, we have the only one on the East Coast in a museum, in a public museum collection. There's one in the Donald Judd Foundation and one on view at SF MoMA. And it's arguably one of the most important pieces of minimalist art in New England. We also are showing new acquisitions. This is a monumental piece by MacArthur Binion, who lives and works in Chicago. He's one of our most significant abstract artists working today, and a very significant leader in the Black arts community. This is a piece from a series called the DNA series, where on the surface you think that he's just responding to the minimalist grid, which was sort of the lingua franca of minimalist artists like Donald Judd and Carl Andre. But when you get closer, and you can see in this not great cell phone photo on the right, that there's text, there's actually handwriting that can be glimpsed. What he did to make this series is photocopy his own address book from his time when he lived in New York in the 70s and 80s. He cut it up into tiny, tiny little squares, and like a mosaic, layered it on top of this panel. He then takes an oil stick and does the painting over the mosaic of cut up paper pieces. But if you come close enough to read it, you can actually pick out some information. Hopefully they've all changed their phone numbers by now, but there are some really notable artists like Jack Whitten and Joanna Posset Dart, whose names and contact information. So it's this great thing because it's abstract, but it's also deeply personal. And we often think of abstraction as being impersonal, but this just goes to show that abstraction can have really profound personal connections. On the other side of the gallery, we have this three-piece hang of a really wonderful work by Mangold on the left. In the center is a Bryce Marden, and on the right is Joseph Albers. The Bryce Marden in the center was a gift from Carl Andre, who is also one of our most accomplished artist alumni. So the Albers is particularly important, and we use that as a way to tie in the fact that we were the very first museum in the United States to show Albers's work. There was a show that was organized by the Museum of Modern Art. We were often seen as the sort of New England outpost of MoMA because we took so many of their cutting edge early 1930s shows. They had organized a show, no one would take it, but the Addison did. And Albers expresses his appreciation in this letter, and he says, "I'm glad to hear of this. I want to thank you so much for your interest, because it is very difficult to obtain public interest in abstract art." So at a time when museums wouldn't touch abstraction, the Addison was eager to support it. The Addison was very supportive in general of expat immigrant artists from the 30s and 40s, those who were fleeing Hitler's regime in Europe. And I should have mentioned prior that we were actually the very first museum to give a full retrospective to Hans Hofmann, and the first museum to publish an abstract expressionist text when we published his really influential collection of essays, Search for the Real. Here's our Carl Andre case, small works, kind of tabletop works by him, next to his Passport, which is a very important artist book by Carl Andre that documents his travels to Europe and then also his working relationship with Frank Stella, his first marriage. It's a very deeply personal work that he describes as almost as if someone had had taken a core sample right through his brain and put it on page, which is kind of a gory way to think about it. And then above it is this great Joseph Cornell box from our collection. One of the more minimalist pieces by Cornell, known to me at least. Cornell was a graduate, or actually he attended Phillips Academy, he did not graduate. It was one of the very few times, if not the only period of time, that he left New York. He was famously quite a homebody, to put it lightly. I think there's agoraphobia would come closer. But he concocted these incredible works really based on what he encountered in his immediate surroundings. He loved visiting pet stores, and particularly pet stores that sold exotic birds. So this is called Cage, this work, and it's a very highly abstracted bird cage with birds, these sort of marble-looking spheres meant to represent birds inhabiting this cage. So we're just about out of time, so I'll just go very quickly through two kind of sub-exhibitions within the larger 90th exhibition. We have a focus gallery that looks at Edward Hopper's Manhattan Bridge Loop, another great icon of our collection. This large expanse of Manhattan, occupied only by this kind of lonely, anonymous male figure. This occasioned an exhibition in 1940, occasioned a very important letter from Edward Hopper, which is on view publicly for the first time, I believe, ever in our galleries. It's normally stored in our archive, but it's reproduced in every Edward Hopper catalog because it's one of the very few times that Edward Hopper actually talked in a very introspective way about his process. He was famously a man of very few words, and particularly when it came to his art, a man of nearly no words, with the exception of this letter. He also was so excited about this show, which was a single painting show that really dissected, it was called The Architecture of a Painting, and dissected this one painting and taught really an art history lesson, or a lesson more on art composition through this one, by way of this one painting. And he also sent along preliminary sketches, which we now have in our collection, and a photograph of the site of Manhattan Bridge Loop. And then in the MLC, we have things like the ledger book, the very first ledger book, and along with the very first painting from our collection, this Arthur Bowen Davies, which was a gift of Lizzie Bliss, who unfortunately did not live to see the Addison in its completed state. She passed away in 1931, which left a major hole in the Addison and also in the Addison's collecting. I would assume that if she had stayed around longer, the Addison would have been, she was notorious for collecting what was then very controversial European modernism. I have a feeling that the Addison would maybe have ventured into more kind of taking more risks when it came to acquisitions of abstraction, of modernism, had she been at the helm for longer, but we'll never know. We also look at the Artist in Residence program at Andover, which began unofficially in 1930 with the visit of Childe Hassam to Andover's campus. This was while the museum was being built. He did not have a very successful residency. It was actually conveyed to him that none of his paintings were of a high enough quality of the ones that he painted at Andover for the collection. He's very well represented, though, in our collection. We have dozens of works by Childe Hassam in our permanent collection, and had a number of significant works prior to his visit. We would, about 70 years later, acquire this painting, Pearson Hall, Andover, Mass., which Robert McIntyre says is the only possible exception of when it comes to the work. So this was the one that they would begrudgingly accept, which eventually came to us, which we're profoundly grateful for. And then finally, we look at the residency, or almost finally, the residency of Charles Schieler, who was the first official artist in residence at the Addison in 1946. He was invited to come stay for a period of time at the Andover Inn, and he was allowed to bring his beloved dachshund, Ebony, who is featured here in a photograph by Schieler, purportedly taken behind the Andover Inn. So he came with his wife. He had an amazing time at the Addison and at Andover. His one sort of responsibility while he was at the well, actually, he had no real responsibilities, but he interacted somewhat with students, but he mostly photographed. He was not painting at all. Now the only thing that artists in residence are kind of held accountable for is interacting with students. Back then, it was far more loose. He really valued the freedom. He explored Andover, and was really drawn to the Ballardvale section of Andover, which is a former industrial area. And he saw these hulking old mill buildings, which he described later on as like carcasses on the landscape. And he took photographs of them. And then he returned to his studio and would do things like layer negatives and work with plexiglass to work out these very complex melded compositions, these angular kind of geometric compositions like the Ballardvale, which you see on the right, which was purchased by the Addison. It was part of an idea that Bartlett Hayes, the director at the time, had of bringing artists to campus, commissioning works that would then have a really significant appeal to our local population because they were works that were generated out of Andover. So this is an Andover picture by one of the great modern masters. And then finally, this exhibition has occasioned the discovery of a lot of interesting firsts for the Addison. It was a great opportunity an excuse to spend a lot of time in our archives, and it resulted in the discovery of a lot of things, including the fact that Andy Warhol had his first museum exposure at the Addison. He was part of a show in 1947 that was organized by the Addison called Art Schools USA, and it would continue on for about 12 iterations. Bartlett Hayes each year would invite 25 different art schools to each submit 5 to 6 artists, their most promising pupils, and out of that, a smaller number would be selected to exhibit at the Addison. And then from there, an even smaller number would be part of a nationally traveling tour. In that very first show, we had the very first museum shows for Andy Warhol, Ruth Asawa, and Kenneth Nolan. So pretty remarkable legacy there. Later iterations would bring in Jay DeFeo, Paul Warner, a wide variety of artists. We were also the first museum to acquire work by Ruth Asawa. This is a piece called Figures on Green from 1950. We also have incredible correspondence between Bartlett Hayes and Ruth Asawa, including this really beautiful letter with this incredible drawing of a snake on it, which I think references, and it's paired with this painting in the installation in the MLC. And you can see sort of this interest in in organic forms, in dancing, in motion. And of course, while we don't have one of her wire sculptures, if there's anyone out there who has a spare Ruth Asawa hanging wire sculpture, we would love it. We would love to have it. But we do have this very important early work by her that is sort of hinting at future sculptural exploration. And so with that, I've gone just slightly over. I'm usually a lot worse in terms of timing, but I wonder if anyone has any questions. I'd be happy to answer.
Okay. Thank you, Gordon. That was wonderful. And I'll go through, you can probably see the questions too, but why is it called the Addison?
So I got into that right at the beginning. The Addison was founded by Thomas Cochrane, and it's named after his good friend's mother. He was very good friends, perhaps in love with, we think that might have been, he was in love with a woman by the name of Zadie Cobb Bliss at the time. She would later become Goodyear. And her mother was an Addison, which was an old American family. And he wanted to honor this woman, and the plaque in the Rotunda is dedicated to her, and his speech was dedicated to her. And he also was very aware of the fact that if he chose the Addison as the name of the museum, we would probably be first in an alphabetical list of museums. So he was quite smart with that.
Okay. And Gail asks, as the museum itself is not large, where are all of your other objects stored? I know you've mentioned this in previous talks, but
Yeah. So we're really fortunate that even though our facility, well, first of all, what you see when you come to the Addison is not the entire Addison. There's a whole there's a whole basement level that people are not don't have access to, and that's where we have most of our storage. And we're very fortunate to be able to store almost the entirety of the collection on site. That's very rare for a museum to have that ability. So with the exception of a few really, really large things that we store offsite, everything is at our fingertips, which makes it very easy to work with the collection, to explore the collection, and it's stored on site, and it makes it accessible also for scholars. They don't have to plan months in advance to come to the Addison like you do at some larger museums that have to figure out how to get the artwork out of storage. We can pull almost anything right out from storage and bring it up to our Museum Learning Center, which is open to the public, and the public can request to see anything in our collection that's not on view by just submitting a form in advance.
wow. Okay. So if you can see the Q&A, you'll see that Bill Agee is here and
Oh yeah,
commenting on your comparison of the Hopper
I
and
was
Davis
afraid to talk
clusters.
about Stuart Davis and Bill Agee's. Bill Agee is the Stuart Davis expert, so I was a little nervous talking about it. But I see he's talking about the the comparison between the Hopper and the Davis Gloucester scenes. Hopper as cubist, and Bill has a new book coming out that I'm really excited about on American Cubism, and he thought that the comparison was interesting. And then he is also asking about the residency program, which I'm trying to think if it was. I don't know if it was the first sort of. It's definitely one of the first. I don't know if like the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum had sort of an artist in residence program that would have predated ours. There are others, but of this sort where the artist was, being brought to a campus to sort of engage informally with students, and then to create work that was then accessioned into the collection. That doesn't happen at the Gardner. That was probably the first of its kind, and has certainly served as a model for many subsequent programs.
Okay. Well, there are no other questions, just lots of high praise as
Oh,
usual
thank you.
for
Oh, thank
you,
you.
Gordon. So
Thank you.
thank you. This was wonderful. And the recording will be ready in a few days. Everyone will get an email with a link to the recording. And I did include in the chat where on the library's website you can find past Addison lectures, including Bill Agee's lecture, which was wonderful. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your time on the West Coast,
I
Gordon.
will.
Thank you for
I will.
taking time out to talk with us. And thank you everyone for coming, and we look forward to doing this again.
Definitely. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. Bye-bye now.